we also live in this society now where the prevailing attitude is, if you don't agree with me, then you're not just wrong, but you're a bigot and a racist and deserve to be cancelled. So,
or worse.
Or worse. So I think there's a perception that Western governments particularly have been weak on woke. They've been weak on the so-called tolerants who are actually extremely intolerant. How does the silent majority cope with this?
Well, usually, often, too often, perhaps by putting their head in the sand. I mean, that's certainly the case in my country because it's taken multiple dismal turns for the worst in the last 8 years. But it's led, the Liberals there were led by a very charismatic leader who's extraordinarily narcissistic and who's used compassion. Look, if you're really narcissistic and manipulative, the best disguise is compassion. And you can get very good at acting that out. And if you're very good at it, it's very hard to stand against you because your constant excuse is, well, I'm just doing this for the good of someone else, and not only for the good of someone else, but for the good of the most oppressed and suffering.
Yes.
You know, and if you're good at that, it's very hard to, first of all, it's very hard to be suspicious enough to actually detect the magnitude of that lie. And second, it's hard to stand against it without easily being tarred and feathered as a bigot. You know, when I first came to some political trouble, let's say in Canada, in 2016, I spoke up against a bill that I thought was an unwarranted intrusion into the realm of free speech and free thought, which is what it was, but it was guised in the cloak of, well, we're just caring for the least of the lesser, who was in this case people confused about their sexuality and their gender, trans people, let's say, and the immediate accusation towards me was that I was hateful and a bigot. Well, you know, it's, why did you choose this hill to die on? Why don't you care about these poor suffering people? Can't you just use the language that would make them feel better? And then if you are also, you know, why are the governments weak on that sort of thing? Look, I talk to conservatives and classic liberals all over the Western world, individual by individual. And although this is starting to change to some degree, they're all terrified of being torn apart by the bloodthirsty mob, and no wonder.
But then that suggests that politicians may have lost their courage. And I'm wondering what your analysis is of Rishi Sunak's...
No, the mob just got more effective.
Well, maybe. But you've met with some Conservative MPs this week. I mean, has Rishi Sunak's conservatism lost its way?
Well, he inherited a mess, to be fair. And how Boris Johnson got enticed down the net zero road is just beyond me. I think it probably had something to do with his young wife, you know. But he swallowed hook, line, and sinker the apocalyptic narrative that implied that the only way forward into the future was to decimate poor people and to make energy more polluting and 10 times as expensive, which is rather a preposterous plan, as we can see by how it's laid itself out in the UK and even more stunningly in Germany. And poor Sunak's in a position where he has to go, that looks like it was a mistake, which isn't really a glorious vision of leadership. And I don't really know what he's supposed to do with that mess. Now, what he's been doing is rolling it back to some degree, and you might say perhaps not fast enough, and I suppose I would incline to agree with that, but by the same token, I'm glad I'm not in his shoes. What the conference here this week was designed to suggest, at least in part, was a broader vision than the mere vision of, oops, it looks like we made a mistake on the energy and environment front.
Although there are some Conservative voices, you've just touched on this in this interview, who feel like they are mooted. You know, you hear Miriam Cates or Danny Kruger talk about the value of family, and then there are people waiting in the wings to clamp down on that. You're being sexist, you're being derogatory towards women by referencing their role in a family. You've been scapegoated by the left, some could argue, once described, I think, as, how was it, a pseudo-intellectual hero to the incel community.
That's a good. That was a pretty good line. That one.
I mean, but what's your reaction to those sorts of criticisms, which must be very hurtful?
Well, they were hurtful for a good while, but after a while they just sort of became comical because they just got more and more absurd. Look, every category has an ideal at the center and a margin at the fringe, and if the center is destroyed, the margin will be demolished as well. Now, the radicals think that you can bring the margin to the center, but that's preposterous because a margin is a plurality. And if you bring the plurality to the center, you demolish everything. You demolish the category. Well, look, if you have the nuclear family as the minimal ideal. Obviously, you simultaneously exclude to some degree those people who aren't in that constellation. But if you destroy the constellation itself, everyone disappears. So I'll give you an example. So we had LGB and then we had LGBT. Well, now the T is destroying the L and the G. And the reason for that is that the margin will devour itself. And so it might be the case that my pro-family stance marginalizes, but it's even more the case that the stance that says any old thing goes destroys absolutely everything. And you're naive to think that that's not the case. And I think that what's happening, 80% of the kids who undergo, at least before this recent explosive epidemic on the female side, 80% of the kids who are undergoing gender transformation surgery unnecessarily are gay. Right, well, that's a classic, stellar example of what happens when the margin takes the center. The margin can't take the center. Now, so that brings up a real problem, which the leftists point out to, is like, how do you have a category, say with the family, that nuclear family as the minimal ideal, without being prejudiced against other people? And it's something like an informed and humble tolerance. You know, like, there's divorce in my immediate family. You know, and certainly in my extended family, my sister's being divorced, my brother's being divorced, my daughter's being divorced. Every family has people in it who are single or who are widowed or who are in gay relationships. I mean, the family is an ideal that's breached more than it's adhered to, but that doesn't mean you get to sacrifice the ideal. No. The ideal still has to stay. And then we have to live with the tension between the ideal and the fragments that surround it that actually make up, well, even if you're in a dedicated marriage. I mean, there's been times in my marriage with my wife where our relationship was very tense. And so we moved away from the ideal, but you don't throw out the ideal just because it's difficult to attain and because it excludes what's not ideal, because then you destroy everything. If you have no ideal, there's nothing to work for. And the notion that we can somehow move beyond the minimal nuclear family, I just don't think there's any evidence for that whatsoever. And I would also say that when contemplating that, we might want to look at those who are truly the most vulnerable and victimized, and the ones who are most vulnerable and victimized by the breakdown of the nuclear family are 100% children. It's plain and absolutely simple. Children without fathers, for example, do way worse. And that if the evidence that's been accrued on that side isn't convincing to you, then no evidence about anything ever would be convincing about anything.
Although